Hello, and welcome to part 2 of the Orthopedic Practice Strategy and Growth Forum series. My name is Nivedita Patel, and I'm a shareholder in the Health Law Transactions Group of Baker Donelson. Tonight we have 3 great presentations for you over the next hour. First, myself and Dr. Barsoum, President and Chief Transformation Officer at HOPCo, will discuss how to exit a PSA or employment model with a hospital. Next, we'll hear from Collin Hart, Managing Director of ERE Healthcare Real Estate Advisors, on how to maximize value in your medical real estate. And lastly, we'll hear from Oschman, Partner and CEO at Vestia Personal Wealth Advisors, on how to think about your personal wealth strategies when considering a strategic transaction. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. You'll see a question and answer box on your screen. Please feel free to ask any questions that you may have for our presenters there, and we will answer them as they come. In addition, you will have access to a PDF presentation, and they will be sending a PDF out to all of the attendees tonight as well. So to get us self-started, Dr. Barsoum and I are going to talk a little bit about how orthopedic surgeons can exit from a PSA or employment with a hospital, a multi-specialty group. We're going to talk through some of the legal, financial, and practical considerations involved when thinking about separating from your current model. First, we're going to talk about why orthopedic surgeons may be considering these options. Second, we're going to talk about how to assess your current circumstances. Then we'll get into how to think about your next steps. And lastly, we'll talk about putting together a transition plan. So first, I want to turn it over to Dr. Barsoum to tell us a little bit about what's going on right now and why orthopedic surgeons may be considering their next steps and why they may want to exit a professional services agreement or employment model.
Well, thank you very much, Nivedita. It's a pleasure to be here. You know, it's interesting as you talk to orthopedic surgeons around the country today, we still see that about 50% of orthopedic surgeons end up leaving their first job. And I think it's for a variety of reasons. Many folks will exit residency or fellowship and take, in many cases, an employed job at a healthcare system because, candidly, they tend to pay more initially. And over time, they may find that it's the greatest job in the world. On the other hand, they may find that it doesn't quite work for them. So, you know, when we see clinicians that are looking to leave an employed practice, it usually comes down to one of several different reasons. First, kind of what stage they're at in their career. Are they early enough in their career where their feeling is, if this isn't right for me, I have plenty of time to make up for it while I wind down and wind back up somewhere else. It's worth it to me, and this isn't quite what I wanted. So that clearly plays a role. Usually folks that have been in practice in an employed model for most of their career, there's more trepidation with leaving, very candidly. So I think that's the first. The second is many of these agreements initially offer guaranteed high salaries. And over a period of time, those salaries may change. They may go into a production-based model, and that may or may not live up to the promise that they were hoping that it would lead to initially. The third is autonomy. You know, when you leave residency or leave fellowship and you go into practice, to some degree, it's almost a little bit of a relief to know that many of the major decisions have been made for you. And things are fairly straightforward. As you become more experienced, you may discover that you want more autonomy. You want to pivot on the marketing strategy. You want to change the implants that are being used, but at this hospital system, you only have 1 or 2 options, and that may not be okay with you. So the idea of having more autonomy clearly plays a role. The other is changes in organizational. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to give an example of that. We're working with a group of physicians who were in private practice as a group, then became employed by a hospital, and now for, frankly, compensation reasons, they're looking at other options. And The older physicians are interested in going back to private practice because that's what they've done before and they know they're not risk averse to that. Whereas the younger physicians are actually a little bit more nervous about going to private practice because of the unknown. And like what you just said, the younger folks, like you go into employment, you know what you're going to get, there's less risk. So it is interesting seeing kind of the generational differences and what people are willing to do.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing to that, Nivedita, which is kind of interesting. There is kind of this interesting paradigm of folks that were in private practice and then go into either an employed model or a PSA with a healthcare system, and then over time decide they don't want to do that. And I would say one thing to be very cognizant of, especially if your model, whether it's an employment model or a PSA, if it's only 2 years or 3 years long, I would say, make sure that you don't lose the identity of your practice, that you don't lose the ability to market the name of your practice. Because if you go from being, Will Barsoum Orthopedics to such and such healthcare system orthopedics, you may very well lose the identity, the branding that you've had for so long, and that goes away. So it's, especially if it's a shorter term contract. So that's just something I think that's important to keep in mind as you're thinking about that next stage, because hopefully it'll work out and it'll be great, but sometimes it doesn't. You just want to make sure that you have your options open to you.
Any other reasons why physicians are looking to move out of this model and kind of look at other options?
Yeah, the other big one that we hear about is kind of changes in direction, right? If a healthcare system is acquired by somebody else, and that changes the direction of the organization, maybe a burnout situation, or we hear about physician burnout all the time today. But if you're really on a model that purely rewards productivity, and you can't really continue to deliver at that level, and you just want to do something else, maybe something that you may find fulfilling in a different way. I think that's another big reason. So those I think are the main reasons that people may want to be looking for a change.
Yep. So once a physician finds himself in one of these positions where they're like, you know what, I think I need to make a change, it doesn't happen overnight. And one of the first big steps that you need to do is understand what your current circumstances are. So you have to dust off that PSA or employment agreement that you've not looked at in 5, maybe even 10 years, that your lawyer drafted very carefully for you at the time, and look at it and read it honestly. There's some main kind of topics that you would want to focus on. One is going to be just really simply your notice requirement. Some PSAs that are maybe 10 years long, I've seen have even a 12-month notice requirement, or it could be 180 days. Before you're going to make any sort of move, you need to understand kind of what your parameters are, and then you're going to back into kind of your time frame. So understanding what your termination and notice rights are very important. Sometimes PSAs also have a lock-in periods. So it might be a 10-year term because, again, the hospital wanted to lock you into a longer term, but you have a right to get out after 5 years, let's say. So you need to carefully understand what those rights are. The second thing, which is important and sometimes confusing to some folks, is the non-compete and the non-solicitation provision. So the non-compete, everybody's heard of a non-compete. There was some discussion over the years about our federal ban on non-competes. That has not occurred. There is a lot of state-by-state variability with regard to non-competes, and even more specifically, healthcare provider non-competes. So California, for example, has an outright ban. Maryland is a state, for example, where it's not permitted for anyone with a salary lower than a certain threshold, but for healthcare providers over a threshold, it's permitted, but the scope is a little bit narrow. So, it's important to understand your non-compete, and also perhaps think about whether when your agreement was signed, to determine whether it's still enforceable, because states right now are making constant changes on non-compete laws. So it's important to see what's enforceable or not. The second piece is a non-solicitation. So if you are going to leave your hospital and move into private practice, for example, and you want to take your NPs, PAs, staff with you, you need to understand whether you can do that based on the non-solicitation provisions in your agreements. And I don't know, Dr. Barsoum, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of the non-compete and what you've seen as far as folks, what it might matter to them in the community if they're looking to strategize about whether non-compete matters to them or not?
Yeah, I think that's frequently one of the most complex questions that comes up. You know, if you're looking to pick up and leave, you know, you've practiced on the East Coast and now you want to live your dream and go live in Montana or something. That's usually fairly straightforward. I think most groups are pretty comfortable with that. It's really for if you want to leave and you want to set up shop, you know, and directly compete with your prior employer. That's usually where the challenge is. Now, I think one thing that is important to think about when it comes to non-competes as well is even in many states that prohibit non-competes, there are some carve-outs usually. Now, obviously, I'm not an attorney, so I'll leave this part of the expertise to you, but one of them, for example, is if you've sold your practice.
Right.
So if you've sold your practice to the hospital, even in a state with a non-compete, you may still be held to a different standard than if you just kind of joined the healthcare system, you know, out of fellowship or just became employed, as opposed to having had money change hands for the sale of a practice.
And if you sold your practice through an asset purchase agreement, we'll say to a hospital, you need to look at that asset purchase agreement. Typically, the non-compete in that asset purchase agreement will be for a longer period of time and a greater geographic scope than your employment agreement. So you definitely will want to look at that to make sure you're not in violation of the terms of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that I would add to this is if you are choosing to make this move, you know, what I've usually found is the best course of action is transparency, is to sit down with your healthcare system, especially if you want to stay local in the region. I mean, really, in terms of what most healthcare systems want is they want to make sure that you're going to continue to support them for hospital appropriate cases. That's really kind of what they're looking for. And it tends to be a two-way street in terms of the fact that, you know, if you've been a good provider to them and you've built strong relationships with that primary care practice, you really don't want to leave burning bridges.
Right.
You know, I remember somebody once told me that you're always remembered for how you join a new employer and how you leave an employer. And you know, my sense is by sitting down, having thoughtful conversations about why this particular model may not work for you, but the fact that you would like to do something different, many times your hospital employer will be supportive and will work with you to try to make a smooth transition. And ultimately, that's really what we want, not only for ourselves professionally, but also for our patients to be able to make sure that they have the ability to continue to follow you. I've seen non-competes where if you leave, your own established patients, you're not allowed to see them, which seems pretty crazy to me, to be perfectly candid. But it is definitely something that is in some non-competes, that if you stay in town, you can't see your own patients anymore. And
that falls under the non-solicitation of patients, right? So that's another third provision that you should be careful to look at and make sure you understand your parameters and your restrictions. Another area is malpractice, right? So you want to see whose obligation it is to purchase and cover the tail coverage when you leave. And if it's on you and you're responsible, you will start wanting to start getting quotes to see what that's going to cost you, so you can kind of put it into your calculations when you think of what this cost of transitioning out will actually cost you. We'll talk about that a little bit later. If you got a signing bonus, for example, if you're an employee and you got a signing bonus, look at the repayment process for that if you haven't already come to the term that you needed to work for. You also want to look at the medical records access. So again, if you sold your practice to a hospital and they have all the medical records, sometimes you want to look at, there's two things that can happen. One is you actually in the documents have certain unwind rights related to buying back your assets, getting your office lease back, getting your staff back, your medical records back. If that's not there, those are items that you're going to have to negotiate as part of the separation. So you want to know very clearly what you're contractually allowed to do versus what you're going to have to negotiate, so you know what you're up against.
So if I can add something to that as well, Nivedita, I think one thing to also be cognizant of is the dynamics of your practice today. Meaning, if you're planning and if you're part of a large group that's an employed group, 10 or 15 surgeons or clinicians, and you're looking to leave by yourself, probably different than if there's 8 of you all looking to leave at the same time, right? That will probably cause a lot more heartache for the healthcare system. And I will also say it will be more challenging for all of you to get busy at the same time. So it's just, again, just understanding those dynamics really does play a role in terms of, thinking through this and making sure you have all of your I's dotted and your T's crossed. Yeah,
I agree. And I'm actually going to bring that up, as we transition and talk about kind of your second step. And these steps are really running in parallel. They're not, sequential. As you're you're doing your due diligence about what your current circumstances are. You're also thinking about what you want to come next. And you probably should have a plan A, a plan B, and maybe even a plan C. As things change, you need to make sure you understand your options. So some of those options could be independent practice, joining an existing group. And that could be even if you are one person or a group of, 10, or forming your own group. We've had a group before leave an existing group, one division, left an entire group, and then formed their own legal entity. And then we help them negotiate a PSA with the local hospital. Finding a new strategic partner. So you could go out on your own and then contract with a management company, or even, going from an employment model. And if it's not working there and you maybe want more autonomy, staying with that hospital, but in a PSA model instead. So there's a lot of options. I will say one thing that's very important if you're moving as a group is to be aligned. And that's very hard when you have 5, 10, 15 different personalities, different generations, different kind of priorities. So oftentimes you'll find like 1 or 2 physicians become kind of the leaders. And other people are working in the background or having other conversation. It's really important, if possible, to make sure that you're all talking in unison and there's not kind of internal politics, because that's going to make the entire process that much harder. So Dr. Barsoum, do you want to talk a little bit about, when you're vetting through these various options of what your next step is going to be, what are some key things that or factors that you should be considering when thinking about your plan A, B, and C?
Yeah, look, I think cultural alignment is number 1, 2, and 3, right? Are you culturally aligned with your new partners? Are you culturally aligned with your strategic partner if you're going to have a strategic partner? Are you culturally aligned with your management company? Because again, I mean, the boxes that you have to check are many, right? You have to make sure that you're in network with payers. So you have to be able to negotiate those rates. You have to make sure you have a place to see patients. You need an electronic medical record or some way to track. What kind of ancillaries are you looking to have? Do you want those on day 1, or do you want those after 6 months, a year, 5 years? What is your liquidity situation? Right? When you first go into practice, keep in mind, there's going to be, 30, 60, 90 days before 1 penny comes in other than collecting, these small copays at the front door. So how are you going to float the practice? Do you need a line of credit to make sure that you can make payroll? Many times you'll see, as an employed doctor, that you work with a nurse practitioner, you work with a physician assistant, and you're used to that level of support. All of a sudden now you're in private practice, and you're thinking, well, gee, do I really need this $200,000 cost from a salary, wages, and benefits perspective on day 1, or can I wait until I'm, really ramping up, and then I'll get that additional support? For right now, I'll see all my post-ops, I'll see my established patients, I'll do the injections, because A, I need the revenue to come in, and B, I can't really afford the added expense. So thinking through liquidity, thinking through space, thinking through EMR, thinking through being in network with providers, and also understanding the dynamics of your region, meaning, are you leaving a healthcare system that also happens to be owned by a large payer, which controls 70 or 80, 90% of the commercial pay in that region. Well, that's going to be pretty tough to get in network if you're leaving kind of against their wishes. So again, understanding what those dynamics might be, I think are very, very important to think about on the front side.
And maintaining, I think also we need, like, maintaining the referral relationship with the hospital. I think you mentioned keeping good relationships if you can.
Absolutely.
Can
Absolutely.
you talk a little bit about that, the management partnering with a strategic partner? It's kind of like a middle line where you get the autonomy of a private practice, but also some of the liquidity and kind of the support that you need through a management company.
Yeah. So look, I think management companies, as long as you're culturally aligned with them, can be extraordinarily helpful, right? I mean, groups that run large management companies are very, very good at working with insurers. They have national relationships many times. They understand real estate, and they understand how to negotiate space. They understand build outs. They have relationships with electronic medical record companies. They understand revenue cycle. So, if you really want a turnkey solution, that can sometimes, offer a turnkey solution. Now, I'll also tell you that not every management company can offer a turnkey solution. In many cases, many management companies will just work with established practices. They're not looking to start practices from scratch, because without a doubt, it is more work. It's a much heavier lift. And it requires, I think, in many ways, a special group of providers that are ready and willing to do this. If you're on your own, you're probably not going to find a management company that is willing to do this for you by yourself. If there's 8, 10, 12 of you, it probably will make a lot more sense for both you and for the management company to work together. But having that upfront, candid conversation in terms of what are the fees associated with this, how is this going to work short-term and long-term, and what is your access to liquidity, and what do you plan to do with that money? Those are the key questions to ask up front and to have a really thoughtful, honest conversation about.
That's helpful. So now we're at the point where you want to make a move, your circumstances that are currently going on, what your plan is, like where you want to go. How do you effectuate that? So it's really important that you come up with a transition plan. And this is kind of like a timeline that you have to back into. If you want to go live on this date in your new scenario, whether it's now private practice or joining a management company, you need to have some things that you're looking at to get that start up and running. One, of course, we already talked about, is the notice. And Dr. Barsoum already mentioned, while it is always better if you can maintain the relationship with the hospital by having open discussions, maybe over weeks or months, so that they understand kind of why you may be unhappy or why you're looking for a change, that's ideal. But I've seen other circumstances where, 8 physicians get together and give their, 180 days notice on the same date, and they're kind of done. I don't know, Dr. Barsoum, what are your thoughts on kind of, I know we talked about like having reputation and goodwill in the community. I think the preference is to have those discussions. Do you ever think that by having those open discussions with the hospital about why you're not happy, let's say in a PSA or employment model, will if they don't want you to go, how can those discussions maybe turn more contentious, where it wasn't maybe a good idea to have those conversations drawn out?
Yeah, look, I think a couple things. I think if you're in a community where the hospital employs the majority of the providers in that community, and they all have a non-compete, and you're looking to leave, chances are they will do everything they can to enforce your non-compete. Because the worst case scenario for them is you leave, and then that starts a cascade, right? A domino effect of a bunch of other doctors leaving. So the first domino to fall is going to be the one that gets probably hit the hardest from a legal perspective. So I think it's important to recognize how realistic it is to have a successful outcome and be able to stay in that community and maintain a good relationship with the healthcare system. And look, I mean, I think we all want to be optimists, but it doesn't always work. I mean, there are times where you just won't be able to have the outcome that you're hoping to have, and then you just have to kind of buckle up and be ready for a bumpy ride if that is the path that you still choose to take. And it may very well be that you choose not to take that path,
Right.
you know, if those initial conversations go negatively. And I think you have to be thoughtful about that.
Yep. So not only, you know, providing your notice and thinking through those discussions and how you want to approach them, again, whether you're going to have one physician leader have, you know, the conversations on behalf of the entire group, or kind of more of a group scenario, you know, think through each of those steps is really important. As I mentioned before, sometimes the agreement that we're looking at, and again, your lawyer will be able to help you with this, already sets forth the terms of an unwind, but many times it doesn't. And so you have to negotiate each of these pieces, whether that is how you're going to make sure that there's continuity of care for your patients, and you want patients to be able to see you where you land next. You want to be able to take your staff with you, right? If you have an NP or a PA that you've worked with very closely over the years, and you want to make sure that he or she's able to come with you without violating a non-solicitation provision. Those can be very tricky, and you want to make sure that you're thoughtful in the communications you're having, what email addresses you're corresponding. This is like very basic, but don't be using your current employer's email when you're having all kinds of discussions with your attorneys and other folks about your plans to leave. Personal email addresses, please. You have to set up and secure office space. So if you need to find a real estate, you have to engage your real estate broker, find space, build it out. That can take time, right? So thinking through your timeline, you need to first think about everything that you need to do and what time period it's going to take to do each of them. Again, this isn't just a matter of months. This can be, you know, close to a year of the entire thing of thought in your mind to execution. So really need to plan it out. Any equipment, you know, if you want to have any sort of imaging or anything else in your office, you need to think through the equipment, your EHR systems. So negotiating with a EMR for your medical records and all of your staffing. So now you have to find your own billing and coding and revenue cycle management folks. Again, that takes time to build up, and you want to make sure you had a chance to establish your new practice. And also I would say marketing. So, you know, if you're going to set up shop, and I know Dr. Barsoum mentioned like your brand name and what that is, you know, setting up whether it's a new brand name or carrying on something you've had in the past, you have to make notifications to patients and kind of get yourself out there so that on day one, you're able to start seeing patients. So it's really important that you're thoughtful on how you think through all the steps you need to take and then create a timeline to start executing. Dr. Barsoum, any other thoughts on that?
That I think is important as well is, you know, when we go to medical school, frequently we don't really learn about things like 13-week cash forecasts, for example. We don't necessarily think about, you know, everybody thinks an ASC is going to be a huge moneymaker or an MRI scanner is going to be a big moneymaker. It really is important to understand the payer dynamics in your region and in your community to ensure that if you do leave, that these assumptions that you've made in terms of ancillary revenue or technical revenue through ownership of an ASC is real. You know, I think that the whole idea of this conversation is to ensure that people are being thoughtful, that they are being transparent, and they're really thinking through how to extricate themselves, because it could be the very best decision that you ever made, and it can also be the worst decision that you ever made if it doesn't go well.
Yes, I agree with that. And I would say when you're thinking through your timeline also, it's important to gather your trusted advisors. So whether that's a lawyer, an accountant, a real estate broker, you know, think of who you need on your team to really be successful in this entire endeavor. So I think we're gonna wrap up this part of the discussions, and I'd like to turn it over. Thank you, Dr. Barsoum, very much for your insight on this. I want to turn it over to Collin Hart, who's going to talk to you a little bit about how to think about and consider the value of your medical real estate.
Nivedita, thanks so much. This is Collin Hart from ERE Healthcare Real Estate. I appreciate the lead in, and I thought a lot of the comments that you and Dr. Barsoum had at the end of your last session were pretty relevant in terms of thinking about real estate. I know you were talking about it more from a strategic perspective, but many of our clients are thinking about it from an investment perspective. And so tonight, what we're going to do is talk through how to maximize the value of your medical real estate. You know, whether you are part of a hospital, whether you own your own practice and are part of private practice, you probably have real estate in some form. And if you're a larger, more established group, it's likely that you probably even own your real estate. And so what we find more often than not is when folks are contemplating or considering a strategic transaction or a private equity transaction or a hospital deal, they're so focused on that transaction that they're not really thinking about the real estate, and it can be a big part of their net worth, oftentimes their retirement. So I just want to make sure, can you see my slides, Nivedita? I think they're coming through. So let's just talk about why physicians buy or build their real estate. And so a lot of them are kind of self-explanatory, but first of all is control, right? So if you own your practice, you want to retain control. You don't want to be responsible for leasing space from another party, from a third party who maybe risks your long-term occupancy of that space. So that tends to be the number one driver of people buying their practice or surgery center real estate. The next one is just owning your home, right? Like you think about it, you may spend more time in your clinic or your surgery center than you actually do in your home. So to own your work home is an appealing idea. Also, when you invest in real estate, there's a potential for upside. So just like any investment, why you would buy into your medical real estate, your surgery center building, or your practice facility is because you forecast that there might be some upside there or appreciation in the value of that asset. Next, people buy into their real estate or acquire their real estate for passive income. Obviously, we're always talking about physicians looking at their ancillaries and how do we increase ancillary revenue. And so rental income can be one of those. And then the last one is to build equity, right? So if you're going to pay rent somewhere, whether you're paying rent to a new third party or to yourself, if you own your building and you're paying rent to yourself, which is what you would need to do and how you would set it up, you're kind of paying down that mortgage. So the thinking is, hey, why pay down someone else's mortgage? Why don't I pay down my own mortgage? So these are all the reasons that physicians buy or build their facilities, just to kind of lay the groundwork for our discussion. So next, we're going to talk about what changes when you go into a private equity transaction. And so most of our clients, as I mentioned, bought or built their building to control the destiny of their practice. And so when you own your building, you have an LLC set up for your real estate, you have your PC or corporation or LLC set up for your practice, and you're simply paying rent from one side to another. So that means that, or one pocket to another. So that means that you can control all the decision making because you own both sides. You control the full equation. You can change your rent, you can change your lease. During COVID, a lot of our clients decided, hey, we're going to pause on paying rent to ourselves just because operating income was lower or they weren't operating at all. So these are all the things that you have control of, and you really control the destiny of that asset when you own it, when you own both the practice and the real estate. As you explore a strategic transaction, a hospital transaction, a private equity transaction, it really changes the dynamic. So now instead of paying rent from one pocket to another, your practice has transitioned ownership and now it's owned by someone else. And so they're controlling the decision-making on the practice side, or in this case, the tenant side of the equation, if we're thinking just about real estate. And so now they decide, what is the length of the lease? How much rent am I going to pay? What are we thinking about from a longevity standpoint? Is this a long-term strategic location for us or not? And so it's really important to get a handle on your current real estate position as an owner of the building and owner of the practice before you get into a strategic transaction, because once you go through that transaction, the lease is the lease. You do not have the power to change it anymore, because now that decision-making is held by the hospital or private equity, right? So we just want to highlight that there is a shift in dynamic when you sell or bring in a joint venture partner into your practice. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, oftentimes our clients say, well, I don't want to mess with the real estate because I don't want it to affect my practice sale, or, I don't want to change the occupancy of my building. It works. Let's just go with it, right? And so we actually think that's a little bit of a misnomer. When you sell your practice, there's some changes that are going to occur. You're going to be an employee likely of that enterprise. And so it's a big deal, right? You are now you're not going to be told how to practice medicine, but your staff might change, your billing practices might change, things will change. When you sell your real estate, really all that changes is who you pay your rent to. And so what I want to identify in this presentation is that a lot of folks feel like selling your building or preparing for a sale of your building really has the potential to jeopardize your operation. I would make the argument that it has very little impact on your operation, provided you have a good lease in place, which is what we're going to talk more about. So I just want to highlight that there are a lot more dynamics related to a practice transaction. Real estate's real estate. You need somewhere to work. You need somewhere to see your patients. You need somewhere to perform cases. You're going to pay rent to someone, whether it's from one pocket to another or to a new third-party landlord. And so just keep that in mind. So why do people care about all of this, right? So let's talk about the math and what we like to compare are EBITDA versus rent. And so basically what we're outlining in this diagram is that if you're contemplating a sale of your practice, you should think about what is the multiple that I'm going to generate on a practice sale. And so sometimes I would say oftentimes now, unless you're a really large practice, we're typically seeing single-digit multiples of EBITDA on the practice side. On the real estate, however, we're seeing double-digit multiples, typically 12, 13, 14, 15 times. Now, keep in mind, when you're selling your practice, you're selling for a multiple of earnings or EBITDA. When you're selling your real estate, we're talking about a multiple of rent. And so while these are different numbers, they interact with each other. And so what we always tell our clients is if you're contemplating a practice sale, think about what that multiple is and compare it to a potential multiple on the real estate, which again, let's say 13 times. And so more often than not, the multiple on the real estate is going to be higher. So how do we change that? Well, your rent dictates the value of your real estate. A lot of folks focus on location, and the old adage in real estate valuation is location, location, location. In specialized real estate like a surgery center or specialty hospital or specialty clinic, it's really not about that. It's really about how much rent is there, what's the specialization of the space, and what's the strength of the lease. And so when we're guiding and preparing our clients through a transaction, we're trying to kind of get them thinking about this dynamic and understanding really how it works in the specialty medical real estate world. And so our guidance typically is, even if you don't want to sell your real estate today, if you want to preserve and create more value in that asset, which you can capitalize on immediately or at a later time, it often makes sense to make sure your rent is in the range of fair market value, oftentimes at the higher end of fair market value. And again, that is just because we're going to sell for a higher multiple on the real estate. So it tends to make sense to shift a little bit of your EBITDA over to rent. And it's going to reduce the value of your practice a little bit, but it's going to create more than that loss on a real estate liquidity event. So this slide is typically really helpful. Again, we're not quoting multiples on practice or real estate sales, but what I'm trying to highlight is the differentiation in terms of how those assets are valued, and that it makes sense to pay attention to your real estate. So then last slide from me, what we're going to talk about is what makes for a good lease. So we already talked about the rent and how rent is the biggest lever in value. But now let's talk about lease term. So a lot of our clients have set up their lease, or their brother-in-law did their lease, 10 years ago. He's an attorney, by the way, but he's only moonlighting as an attorney. And so they're comfortable with the lease, but it's been sitting in a drawer for a decade. So a big mistake that we see is people take their existing lease and they sell to the hospital or private equity, and the hospital just assumes that existing lease. And so that's a mistake, because that was a lease that you set up between yourself, right, between practice and real estate entity, and now it's with a third party. And so you want to get a much stronger new form of lease in place. So the big value drivers or things that create security in your real estate investment are having a long-term lease. So if you're contemplating a hospital deal, we typically say, hey, you should have a 12 to 15-year lease. I would say 10 as the bare minimum, but 12 to 15 years is typically what it takes to optimize the value of a building. Typically, you're going to want annual rental escalators. So, we see the cost of everything is going up. Rent tends to be in that direction as well. And so typically we find that 2 to 3% annual rental escalators is a great preserver of value in your real estate, and helps, even if you're going to hold your real estate for a long time, it helps your rent keep up with inflation, which, again, preserves the value of your real estate. And then the last piece that makes for a great lease is for the lease to be triple net. And so that's a jargon term that comes out a lot from real estate folks. But what that means is that in addition to rent, in addition to your practice or the hospital, if you sell to the hospital, paying rent or base rent at fair market value, they're also going to pay for the operating expenses of the building. So the three nets, or the three primary operating expenses associated with the building, are property taxes, property insurance, and building maintenance. And there's all different shades of what triple net means, what expenses are included in triple net, what are not, is the tenant responsible for increases in taxes as a result of a sale? What sort of insurance is the tenant responsible for carrying? There's all different nuances, but at the end of the day, you want the majority, if not all, of the expenses to be borne by the operation, meaning the tenant or the practice or the hospital, whatever it is, and that the landlord is insulated from those costs, because the landlord's job is just to collect rent. And so that is triple net. And again, one of the areas that the most argument occurs. But at the end of the day, these are the terms that will help you to optimize the value of your building. And whether you want to sell your building tomorrow after a strategic transaction, or you want to hold it for 20 years, these terms will serve you well. And I think the closing thought that I'd like to leave people with before we transition to Lauren is a lot of our clients believe that real estate is a great long-term store of value, and I agree with that. As a real estate investor and advisor myself, I own real estate and I have it as a preservation of value, and all those things are great. But the dynamic to highlight is that when you own your building and you own your practice, you control everything related to that, and you control and dictate the value of the building because you can change the lease. When you sell your practice, you're no longer in control of the decision-making on the business side and how it interfaces with your ownership of the real estate. Because again, you could change the lease if you owned it all, but now when the hospital owns your practice, they dictate the lease terms. And so it really changes the dynamic of your real estate investment, and typically creates more risk than when you owned both the practice and real estate. So we typically find that post-strategic transaction, post-private equity transaction, provided you have the right lease in place, it typically makes sense to sell your real estate or think about a real estate liquidity event. And so I would just ask our listeners to kind of keep that in mind. Real estate's a great store of value, but it is an investment. And so just like you knew when to make or buy that investment, it makes sense to eventually think about an exit strategy. And so Nivedita, I'd love to use that as a transition to Lauren, where she can kind of talk about what to do with that liquidity post-transaction. And so I guess we can turn it over to her.
Thanks, Collin. That was a really nice practical tips on how to think about your medical real estate. So next we have Lauren Oschman, who's going to speak to us about wealth strategies for when considering a strategic transaction.
Perfect. Thank you both so much for that great introduction, and Collin, great insights as always on the real estate piece of the transaction and those considerations. So I will be talking about your personal wealth considerations for a transaction. a little bit of how I got here before we dive in. So this is me at, I don't know, 2-3 years old with my dad's stethoscope. And then just a few years ago, my dad is an interventional cardiologist. He did all of his medical training at West Virginia University. So that's us courtside at a West Virginia basketball game. I don't know that there is a bigger West Virginia fan than my father. But I actually I'd been doing personal financial planning for physicians for years and years. And then my dad's group was considering an exit. They're owned by a hospital, really were being undervalued in that situation. And so they were looking at a deal themselves. And so we started looking at what was the practice valuation, what was the multiple that they could get from, one of the platforms in cardiology. And then what was the income difference going to look like? They were going to take a cut in income as a result. What was the path to income repair? Really started digging into all of this. And him and a number of his partners, being clients of ours on the personal wealth side, saw the value of having good personal financial representation and guidance going through all of the implications of these transactions. So there are usually numerous advisors on the business side. Not a lot of physicians have good representation on the personal financial side that can really guide them through this and understands this area. So we've since gotten into that, gone through numerous transactions with physicians, helped them build the personal financial plans, helped them understand the financial considerations. And that's a little bit of what I'm going to be bringing to you today. So what's really happening when one of these transactions occurs is we're changing the timeline. Traditionally, in private practice, surgeons will go through their training, residency, fellowship, they'll spend time in practice, they'll buy into the practice. Then at retirement, there is a buyout where they get a check that can kind of turbocharge their way into retirement. When a private equity transaction happens, that timeline is moving up. And it's important to understand that because notice there is not a second buyout coming in my timeline. Now, we'll get to this. There may be a second bite. We hope that there will be. But the reality is we're not seeing those in orthopedic surgery, or certainly not at the rate that we were. And so we don't think that it's wise to count on that. We have to consider that you're getting one liquidity event, and it is during a time of life that's very different than heading into retirement. This is when you might be thinking about upgrading your home. You may be paying private school tuitions. You may be thinking about a vacation house. You may just want to enjoy it. You're thinking about the here and now, not necessarily thinking about the future. And that's where physicians can make mistakes that can be costly. I want you to be able to avoid those. You're getting a large check at close. You often do get some retained equity in the platform. So there's a percentage that's carried on where you get an investment in this platform. And what we hope is that we can get these economies of scale. You get a larger value from the platform and that you can get then those future bites, as they call them, where you could get some payout as the first buyer sells to a bigger buyer, maybe a bigger buyer. And they talk to you in the beginning about those happening every 5 to 7 years. But again, those aren't guaranteed. Historically, we've seen some, but again, we're just not seeing them right now. And so I would not count on those. The other consideration is that your annual income very likely will decrease. Hopefully we see income repair to get you back to where you were before. But again, we don't have a guarantee of that. So we might have to use some of that check that you get up front to help fund your lifestyle and just keep things moving as you need them to. And so that's a consideration as well. So again, often we will see groups will they'll get the attorneys, they'll get the accountants, they'll get the advisors on the deal structure itself, but personal financial preparation is often an afterthought. And here's something to think about. The time to go find yourself a really good financial advisor that you can trust is probably not when you have a multi-million-dollar check in hand. It's well in advance of that for numerous reasons that I'll get to. But most of all, I think because the time you want to decide you trust someone is before you have all of that money at stake. So considerations to be thinking about before a sale. And here's what I'll say. A lot of you here are maybe here to learn what you could be thinking about if there is a transaction in your future. You may not be at that point right now. You may just be learning there may never be a transaction in your future. So a lot of these things I'm going to talk about are things that you should probably get in order regardless. But I also want you to be thinking about if you can have your practice and your personal finances really optimized in a great spot before you think about a transaction, there's going to be more value financially and just to get what you want out of life in that transaction for you. So there is a really good reason to get all of this in good order now. First off, you want to be thinking about the structure of your practice. And by the way, you can grab this QR code. We have a good download that's a checklist for personal financial considerations for a transaction that could be a helpful guide for you. So that you'll see the QR code again at the end, but if you want to grab it now, you can. So thinking about practice structure, I really want you to think here, the biggest place that we see that independent groups have a real advantage compared to some of the groups that have already exited is when it comes to recruiting and retaining young surgeons. So if you can make sure that you have good incentives in place, good partnership track in place for those young surgeons that you're bringing on, that will increase the revenue and the value of your practice for years to come. That's of benefit to you. A lot of you have seen one of our partners, Cameron Helmuth. He speaks often at orthopedic conferences. Some of you have worked with him. He consults with practices on this very thing because it is so valuable. So don't overlook that. Don't ignore that. That's one of the biggest values that you have as an independent practice. Second, you've got to be thinking about taxes. And I don't need to tell you all this. You all know you pay a lot in taxes. There are two lenses through which I would think about this. Number one, you need a really good accountant if you are going to go through this transaction process. And that may not be the accountant that has been doing your practice and personal tax return for years and years and years and years. You don't want someone learning on the biggest transaction of your life. You want someone who is experienced. The difference between income tax, which is high 30s, 40% for most surgeons, and capital gains tax, which is low 20% for most surgeons, is meaningful. You want someone who understands, who's involved in the creation of the deal, who understands how to get more at the capital gains tax rate and less at the income tax rate. I have seen mistakes made in this realm by inexperienced accountants, and those mistakes are six-figure mistakes in this world. So make sure you're working with someone experienced. And then you also, on the personal wealth side, need an advisor who can help you think through how can we create some tax deductions in the year of the transaction to help offset that bigger inflow. Things like, if you are into real estate, we can look at with certain business and rental real estate, bonus depreciation came back with the most recent tax law. That can be very valuable and a big one-year deduction. If you're charitably inclined, things like donor advised funds can be a really useful tool to create more deduction in the year of a transaction. Looking at loss harvesting in your portfolio. There are a lot of things that can be done at any point, but can be extra valuable in the year of a transaction. So timing is paramount. On the personal portfolio side, we want to be thinking about not just how your money is diversified across markets, stocks, bonds, US, international, things like that. We also want to think about diversification from a tax perspective. What do I mean by that? Having money that's in pre-tax vehicles, 401ks, profit sharing plans, cash balance plans, making sure those are optimally funded because oftentimes post-transaction, you can't put as much money away pre-tax. So we want to be mindful of that. Balancing those with Roth type accounts where the money will not be taxed as it grows in the future. If we can structure that portfolio optimally from a tax perspective, and a lot of advisors miss this, who aren't working with doctors day in and day out the way that we are, then you can create the same return, but keep more of it versus giving it away to the IRS. So they say it's not how much you make, it's how much you keep. We want to make sure more of that portfolio return stays with you versus going to the IRS. And then finally, estate planning. And this is one you've got to hear, even if you never go through a transaction. Estate planning is something that time and time and time again, doctors miss. They either don't do it, or they have a basic will that they did when their kids were young, or they were maybe in fellowship. And then years and years and years later, they have never updated it. Especially if you're going to have a multi-million-dollar infusion of capital, you've got to be thinking about estate planning. That dovetails into asset protection. You should have an umbrella policy. This protects your personal liability. You buy it from your home and auto insurance company. If someone wants to sue you in your personal life, and this happened to a client of mine, he hit another car with his car, and the person who he hit, her attorney called his office because she had seen his face on a billboard. So how many of your practices do advertising locally where your face is recognized? I'm thinking of a prominent orthopedic surgeon in my local market I see his face on the elevator in a frequented building here locally because the practice is doing great advertising, but he has a big target on his back as a result because a lot of people would recognize him and think that he has a lot of wealth. Whether or not he actually does is immaterial. So have an umbrella policy. Think through the asset protection with a great experienced attorney. Make sure you've done your personal estate planning and you're taking care of your family and your legacy. So historically, what we've seen surgeons do in these transactions, they will enjoy it. They will pay the taxes they're told to pay. So enjoy it, I mean, buy the car, buy the watch, buy the vacation house. And I'm not saying you can't do that, but they do that first without any other considerations. They'll pay the tax bill they're told to pay, and then they will hope something is left to save. Again, we cannot count on these second and third bites the way that I think people were in the past. So what you need to be thinking about now, first, have a strategic plan for your taxes. A good accountant who's working on your behalf to help you minimize the impact, a good financial advisor who can help you create deductions in the right year, pay the right amount of tax, then put money away for your future. And if you've already built a solid plan before this money was in play, remember I said hire an advisor now. Don't wait till you have the multi-million-dollar check. Build a solid plan. Use a portion of that check as an infusion of capital that can grow for you. I'll show you the power of that here in a minute. And then take the rest and enjoy it guilt-free. You don't have to worry about what you should have done with the money because you're very confident you did all the right things. So I'm going to tell you a tale of three doctors. These are fictitious doctors, but I can put faces with all of them because I've seen these things done over the years that we've been doing this. They're all 45 years of age. They get a $4 million check at the close of a transaction. They have 30% left in the platform, hopefully for future bites. We're going to call them, and you'll find out why I named them what I did: Dr. Early Bird, Dr. Next Bite, and Dr. Disappointed. Dr. Early Bird has had a personal financial planner for years, so he does exactly what I said is the right thing to do. He pays the right amount of tax. He does enjoy a little bit, but he very thoughtfully invests $2.5 million of the deal proceeds right after closing. So he does not waste time. He gets money into the market. Dr. Next Bite and Dr. Disappointed have meant to get a financial advisor. They haven't really gotten around to it. So they pay the taxes they're told to pay. They don't really know whether it's right. Feels like a big number. Could be right. They don't know. They splurge. They do everything that they've wanted to do with that check. And then they're thinking, you know what? There will be that next bite they told me about. I will invest then. That's when I'll take care of the future. You'll probably see where this is going. So 5 years later, the order of the doctors has changed. So notice that. 5 years later, Dr. Next Bite, they're at the top now. He actually gets a second bite. He gets a $4 million check on bite 2. We love that. He decides, he's like, okay, this is what I was counting on. He invests $2.5 million. Dr. Early Bird and Dr. Disappointed were in deals where, and I had a surgeon go through this just recently. They went through a second bite. All it was a return of capital. There was no real gain on what was rolled back in the platform. So better than absolutely nothing, but there was not really a return to do a lot with. Let's look at how it turned out for these three. So remember, Dr. Early Bird, he invested that $2.5 million right away. He, in 16 years at age 60, he has $6.9 million, plenty to retire. And so he actually retires a little early. Dr. Next Bite, remember, he invested the 2.5 million, but 5 years later with the second bite. So he actually also did pretty well. This is all at a 7% return, by the way. He gets to 4.9 million, and he retired just after he planned to, right around age 60. Dr. Disappointed, though. So he, remember that return of capital, he got $1 million after tax in that return of capital on the second bite. He went ahead and spent 500,000 because he had accumulated quite the lifestyle with the way he spent that initial money. So he needed more money for upkeep. He invested $500,000 though. That turned into 980,000 for him. So not even $1 million by age 60. He unfortunately does not have enough to retire at 60. He still has to work despite having those big liquidity events. So you can see it graphically right here. Just the cost of waiting between Dr. Early Bird and Dr. Next Bite, that cost Next Bite $2 million. And remember, Dr. Early Bird actually didn't get as much in the overall deal because he didn't get that second bite. So waiting cost money. The other thing is Dr. Next Bite was not guaranteed to get that bite. And again, I would advise that you do not plan on it. If you enjoy a transaction, have it be the second one, not the first. And Dr. Disappointed, well, you don't want to be Dr. Disappointed. So focus on what you can control. That is not whether you get that second bite. What you can control is what you do with the first one. Here's some disclosures I want you to see. And then if we can be of help, please reach out. We do personal financial planning and wealth management for doctors all over the country. We have a team of 3,600 physician families that we serve across 46 states. So we'd be happy to talk with you, help you build that plan in advance of the exit. And then again, business consulting is something we do as well. We have a depth of experience in orthopedic surgery and orthopedic surgery practices. And you can get our free resource for the personal financial preparedness checklist right there.
Lauren, thank you so much for your time. And thank you to Dr. Barsoum and Collin as well for presenting today. Thank you all for joining this evening. I hope that the presentations were informative and give you some things to really think about if you ever find yourself in a position to consider a strategic transaction. Thank you.